as soon as you hear his voice, you'll realize he's no stranger. He's been at NPR for most of his, if not all of his journalism career. He's a native of Indiana and graduated from Morehead State University, not Morehead.
No, you got it.
I did. Morehead State University, which is in Kentucky. And he's the author of some previous books, Instant City, Life and Death in Karachi, and Jackson Land, President Andrew Jackson, Cherokee Chief John Ross, and the Great American Land Grab. And he will be in conversation today with our guest host, Claiborne Barksdale. Many of you know Claiborne. He lives here in Oxford. He's the former CEO of the Barksdale Reading Institute. He has been a lawyer. He was general counsel for South Central Bell, based in Atlanta at one time. He at one time worked on the staff for Senator Thad Cochran, and in fact, he was doing that at the same time that Lisa and I were working at the Saville Bookshop in Washington, D.C. That was over 40 years ago. So thank you, Claiborne, for hosting this today. He's been a champion of both children, an advocate and champion for both children and literacy for much of his career. So he's always been a big reader ever since I've known him. So Claiborne, thank you for doing this today. I know this is going to be a great conversation, and I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Hey, Steve.
Good evening.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine. It's good to talk with you.
You too. Welcome to Square Books and to Oxford. I gather from our previous little conversation, you have not been here before.
No, I want to get
correct?
there. I've visited Oxford in my mind by reading William Faulkner and that sort of thing, and I'd love to get there sometime.
Yeah, you need to come. It's a great little town. A lot of interesting people doing interesting things, and Square Books is a great bookstore. So
I've
come
heard
down
great
soon.
things about it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I love the book.
Oh, thank you.
A lot of obviously very interesting material there, provocative material, but also very well written, fast paced, a lot to chew on, right? You had a lot to write about.
Oh yeah, it's a lot of material. I'm writing about a husband and wife who became super famous in the 1840s and 50s, which were a couple of the most fascinating decades in all of American history, and also tragic because they were leading up to the Civil War. But they're decades when America assumed the shape that it has now. John Charles Fremont was a Western explorer who was involved in the US conquest of California during the war against Mexico, who was also involved in mapping the trails to Oregon when Oregon was not yet quite formally part of the United States, and encouraging settlers to get there. He would go out into the West, he would make these reliable maps, and then he would come back to Washington, D.C., where he was based, where I am now, and he would write best-selling accounts of his adventures, which would entice people to go along the trails and go to the West and settle, which was part of the plan. Publicity was part of the plan, and he was brilliant at generating publicity for himself. He was in the newspapers all the time. People, papers across the country followed his every move, and a large part of why that worked was his wife, Jessie Benton Fremont, who was the daughter of a very powerful US senator from Missouri, and who was younger than him, but probably smarter than him, and very talented in her own right, and a talented writer, and politically connected because of her father. And she was a woman, and it was the 19th century. She couldn't really have her own career, so she operated through her husband and became his editor, and sometimes his ghostwriter, and definitely his political ambassador and publicist and advisor. And it's just a really remarkable couple who became just, I mean, it's hard to conceive how incredibly famous they were in their lifetimes. It's the kind of celebrity we associate with people now, and they generated that kind of celebrity for themselves then.
Jay-Z and Beyonce.
Yeah, yeah, more or less. And they were good at making John Charles Fremont's um, achievements, which were impressive enough, seem more impressive than they were. There's an episode, as you know, by kindly reading this, that occurred in 1842 when Fremont was leading a couple dozen men along the Oregon Trail. He's in the Wind River Mountains, which is part of the giant Rocky Mountain chain in what is now Wyoming. And he just decides, as an adventure and as an accomplishment, to climb the highest mountain he can find. He plants the American flag on top of this mountain and then just decides it must be the highest mountain in all of North America, and comes back to tell the world he's planted the American flag on the highest spot in North America. And people responded like it was planting the flag on the moon in 1969. It became part of his legend. But of course, he had no idea if it was the highest mountain because nobody had measured all the others. And it turned out not even to be in the top 100. That was the way that he would operate. He would do crazy and in their way impressive things and then somehow make them larger through publicity.
But also things that exposed his men, and they were men,
Yes.
to a lot of danger, and perhaps unnecessarily.
Yeah,
right?
I wouldn't even say perhaps. He would take on more extreme adventures and take on more extreme paths than were necessary. In 1843, he was in Oregon. He was near what is now Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington. And it was late November. And rather than just spend the winter in Oregon, he decided to go back over all the mountains and deserts to St. Louis, and then decided not to go back on the established trails, but to try to find some new trail. And his men very nearly starved. The only way they prevented themselves from doing that was they decided, when they failed to get east, they turned west and hacked over the mountains through many feet of snow to California to get supplies. In a little bit later, in 1848-49, heading for California, he got in even worse trouble in the mountains of what are now Colorado. And it's just an extraordinary story of him going on and on through the snow, even though it obviously wasn't working, until his men were stuck and many of them starved. And it appears that some of them survived only by eating their dead comrades.
Well, I think it was the fourth expedition. And he clearly sets out from St. Louis, the western frontier, as winter is about to hit.
Yes. Yes.
Why?
There were
This was when he was looking for the railroad.
Yes, So I mean, California is out there, has been added to the Union, and because of him, and there is early talk of getting a railroad to the Pacific coast, and he wants to be the guy who's going to find the route through the mountains because nobody knows where that route is going to be. And he gives different reasons at different times for why he started out through the mountains. It appears to me, from looking at the historical record, that he should have gone in the spring and then spend the summer months going through the mountains when the snow's not so bad. He was delayed for various reasons in Washington. He was doing various kinds of politics there. His wife had had a baby, and he decided to go west anyway, even though he was delayed, and didn't get started until the fall, and didn't get into the San Juan Mountains of what is now Colorado until December. And on top of that, it was an especially bad winter. It was atrocious timing. He decided to tell himself, this is all for the good, because I, John C. Fremont, am going to discover if the route is good enough for trains to pass through it in the wintertime. He tried to make a good thing out of it. But just as an amateur, I mean, I'm not a mountain climber. I'm not a railroader, but I'm aware that if you're building a railroad through the mountains, you look for some relatively level route, like a gradual slope at a riverbed or something like that. Rather than trying to find that, he started trying to go over very high ridges, ended up being stuck at something like 13,000 feet with his men. So he seems by the end of this to have completely lost any sense of what he was doing or why he was doing it. And that is part of the frustration of this man. He was extraordinarily talented in many ways. He was very brave. He did go on these extremely dangerous expeditions, but his judgment would fail him in a lot of crucial situations.
Well, you you said a minute ago that maybe Jesse was smarter than he. There didn't seem to be much doubt about that in the reading of the book.
No, and I mean, it's a little unfortunate because we don't have the absolute fullest record we would like of Jessie. She had to
Yeah.
operate through her husband. And so there's a lot of words on the page that you can't be absolutely sure, are these brilliant words his words or her words? And are his clever acts her doing or his doing? But we do know that she was a good writer because later in life, he blew their money. I've neglected to mention this extraordinary life. After assisting in the conquest of California, he purchased land there and gold was discovered on the land. He suddenly was like one of the richest men in America, or appeared to be. In later years, he blew all their money and she took to writing in her own name to help support them. She wrote memoirs of her own life and memoirs of their life together and of things that he had done, and published them in magazines and published them as books. And so thanks to that, along with a number of her letters that survive, we do have her own voice, her own depiction of some of the events of her life. But it's reality that historians have to wrestle with, that when you get into the lives of a lot of characters, unless they're prominent white men, it's the 19th century we're talking about here, unless they're prominent white men, you very often have to struggle to find enough sources to find the details that you really want to know. I was fortunate in this case to have a large record to work with because she did write a lot in her own name and because people seem to have saved several hundred of her letters over time. But there's still not quite as much as I would wish to have. But yes, she's a very smart person.
And for much of the book, I felt that he was, and you used some of these words, that he thrashed around in the wilderness, that he was a dreamer of sorts, that he wanted oceanfront property. And
yeah,
he was a speculator. I mean, he wanted money.
This is one of, he was interested in making a buck, but he was actually, I think, he was restless somehow.
Yeah.
I'm reluctant to speculate too much about the condition of people who are long dead, who never saw a psychiatrist, so far as I know. But Fremont went out on these adventures in the West, and it's the 1840s and 50s. It's rough living. It's life in the outdoors. It's life on a horse. It's life in the snow. They're often sleeping. I mean, it's incredible to me, sleeping in the snow without even a tent. I mean, the snow's too deep for you to pitch a tent. And so you're like laying a rubber blanket on the ground, laying on the rubber blanket, putting another rubber blanket on top, and it's a snowstorm, and you might wake up with an extra foot of snow on top of your blanket. I mean, incredible what they were doing. He witnessed his men die. He was involved, I was about to say in battles with Indians, but it's much more fair to say that he was involved in massacres of Indians. His men committed a number of massacres of Indians. Yeah. His men also were attacked by Indians in what is now Southern Oregon. He went through a lot of experiences, and it is tempting, where I'm going with this, it's tempting to see someone who is suffering from post-traumatic stress. He'd had a difficult childhood. His father had died when he was very young. His mother had been short of money. He kind of scratched his way to the top. He went out on these adventures and found that he loved being out by himself with a small group of men. He loved that work, but I think it took a toll on him. It clearly destroyed some of the men who went with him. There was a map maker named Charles Preuss, who was one of his most loyal people, went on most of his expeditions with him. And Preuss ended his life by committing suicide. Fremont went through these horrible experiences and wrote that he was just fine. And the very fact that you would even say you were just fine after all that makes you kind of doubt that you're getting the whole truth out of the guy.
Well,
and
except
he was restless.
He kept going back. He kept going back.
Yeah, well, that's another thing. I mean, there were men, and you are correct that they're nearly all men, although I would love to discuss sometime, there are records of women who went to California during the gold rush period, which are remarkable. But it's mostly men on these explorations. And They were men who would fall into that life for a little while. and then understand that it was time for another phase of their life, or it was time to spend some time at home with the wife and the kids. And Fremont didn't get beyond it. He couldn't stop going. And even after he had become extraordinarily rich, thanks to the gold rush, and extraordinarily famous, thanks to his publicity and his wife's publicity and his actual achievements, he still kept going out into the wilderness. It devastated his wife, Jessie. I mean, she really, really loved him, and he would be gone for months or even years at a time. But there was something about it that he couldn't stop himself. He was too restless to stop himself and be in one place.
Well, that was another thing, the relationship that they had. As you say, she clearly loved him. She and he would show up for a little while after being away for months with very little communication, if any.
Yeah.
And then off he'd go again. He was a loner. Would you?
Yeah.
He was a loner who was the first Republican presidential candidate.
Yeah,
in
well,
1856.
that's exactly right. It's a remarkable thing. You think of politicians as being a people person. You know, they like to slap your back. They like to shake your hand. They like to give a speech. They like to tell you what's on their mind. They like to write letters and manipulate things. John Charles Fremont didn't want to do any of those things particularly. He was political. He would try to manipulate people, but he left a lot of that, frankly, to his wife, who was better at it than he was, and who was accustomed. It's a remarkable story for a woman, by the way, because she was a daughter of a senator. She had met presidents, and as an adult, she kept right on going over to meet presidents and lobbying presidents for people. Fremont didn't want to do any of that, but he was famous. And he was very briefly a United States senator from California because he was a hero in California. And when the Republican Party was founded in the 1850s, with a goal of bringing together a lot of people from different factions to oppose the extension of slavery in the United States, they wanted to find somebody who was widely admired, but didn't have a very long political record. And they were explicit about this. Like anybody who had a long record could be criticized, and some faction or other of the new party would not like their positions. So it's better to have somebody who hadn't done very much. And Fremont politically had not done very much, but he was opposed to the extension of slavery. He had the proper political views. And he was so widely admired that in 1850, a magazine had called him one of the world's 3 most important historical figures since Jesus Christ. The others being Christopher Columbus, who discovered America, as they would put it then, George Washington, the founder of our country, and Fremont, who gave us a Pacific coast. It's incredible the fame and esteem with which he was held. And Republicans nominated him in 1856 as their presidential nominee. It was the first time that there was a major political party that was anti-slavery in a major way. There had been minor anti-slavery parties before. And their plan was to take advantage of the larger population of the North to win a presidential election and just cut the South out of the business, so to speak. Yeah. And it didn't work in 1856, but Abraham Lincoln tried the same thing 4 years later and succeeded.
Did Fremont and Lincoln, I know Jesse met Lincoln later.
Yes.
He called her,
yes.
You're a good female politician.
Yes, a dismissive way that Lincoln referred to her, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Fremont?
No, I mean,
John Fremont?
No, it's a fascinating thing. I mean, they also communicated later because John Charles Fremont became a general in the Civil War and had conflicts with Lincoln. Right. But in the sure. It's amazing to think of it now. In 1856, there was not much reason that a guy named John Charles Fremont would bother to meet with Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln sure. was an important figure in Illinois, an important Whig political figure, which is an older political party, an important figure in stitching together the Republican Party in Illinois. But in 1856, he was by no means a national figure yet. Sure. I mean, people liked him, people were interested in him. I think there was even some movement to make him the vice presidential nominee in 1856, but he came nowhere close to that. John Fremont was miles and miles ahead of him in terms of fame and power and everything else. Lincoln was a guy who campaigned for Fremont, gave speeches in Illinois, and one fascinating speech in Michigan. And they're very good speeches on behalf of Fremont, but he was just at that point a local operator, and Fremont was so far beyond him. Of course, that all changed in the next few years as Lincoln became famous through his debates with Stephen A. Douglas, and then became the next Republican presidential nominee. By the time of Lincoln's election, Fremont was still very famous, and Lincoln needed him on his side rather than otherwise. And so he appointed him to be one of the top generals in the war, where Fremont quickly demonstrated that while he was a talented explorer, he wasn't a very good general.
Right, right. We had the inauguration yesterday.
We did.
Something that comes through over and over in the book, the echoes, anti-immigration,
Yeah.
obviously race, the telegraph appearing on the scene, and the ability to share information. Did your light just go out?
If you'll forgive me, a 5-year-old has just come and turned off the lights. So perhaps if you guys wouldn't mind. Oh, here's a 15-year-old. If you wouldn't mind leaving, glad to have people along. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. I know it's not your ideal. Why? Because I'm on a Zoom call, sweetie pie. Anyway,
women's rights.
What were we saying? I'm back. Women's rights. That's what we're talking about here. With
we were talking about the echoes in the book. Oh, was that your,
yes,
your daughter turned off?
There are echoes in the book. I want to tell you, by the way, it's kind of great that the kids came and interrupted, because what's behind me here is this home studio where I've been broadcasting most of the time during COVID times. That's the microphone right there. And every once in a while, a small child will come in while I'm live on the radio. She hasn't made a lot of noise. That was an unusual interruption. You're privileged, but it's kind of been fascinating to be living in these times and to be working the way we're working. Anyway, you were asking about the parallels. There are many. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, one of the reasons I wanted to tell this story. We have gone through these last 4 years, and whether we were for President Trump or against him, I think we all agree it's been an unusual time. And it's been a dramatic time, and a time when many people are unhappy with the direction of the country. But you were exactly right to notice that we were having many of the same debates then. We would use different words, the circumstances were a little different, but people were arguing about race. People were arguing about immigration. They were arguing about who gets to be an American, who gets to be a citizen. There was this nativist movement, the Know Nothing movement as it was called, secret societies whose members, if asked, would say, I know nothing about what you're asking me about, that then became publicly powerful. They supported political candidates and captured governorships and entire state legislatures and a lot of seats in Congress. They were very powerful in the 1850s. It was this moment of tremendous tension and division in society, and some political leaders thought the way to unify people was to turn them against this common enemy of foreigners. And I want to say another thing about that, if I may, Claiborne. It wasn't just any foreigners they were concerned about. They were concerned about foreigners with a particular alien religion, which in that case was Catholicism. Right. And it was said that there was, the Pope was going to direct Catholics to take over America, or that European powers were going to use Catholics to take over America, and that foreigners had to be kept out, or kept out of office, or prevented from voting. And that was the clue to the whole thing, I think. Immigrants were thought to be more likely in those days to vote for one political party, which was the Democratic Party. And so if you were opposed to the Democratic Party, it was very easy for you to start advocating against letting immigrants vote, because you felt the immigrants were beating you at the polls, and the way to win the election was to prevent people from voting.
And there was also another little echo. There was the allegation that Fremont was not actually born in the United States.
Yes, it's incredible. It's incredible to find these things. Fremont was the son of an immigrant, the son of a French immigrant. And people, when he ran for president, his opponents began suggesting that perhaps he'd been born actually outside the United States, that he was an immigrant himself and therefore ineligible for the presidency. Now that was a lie in many different ways. His mother was indisputably an American citizen, therefore he was natural born American, as they would say. But people were just throwing anything at the wall. And it's weird and complicated because the new Republican Party was trying to get some of these anti-immigrant types to vote for them. So to suggest that Fremont was a foreigner was a way to drive their own voters away from the new party. But it is, I mean, it's really amazing to find this stuff in the archives that feels like it's ripped from headlines from the other day. In the 1856 presidential election, Republicans were very concerned about apparently bogus stories that there had been voter fraud in Pennsylvania.
Right.
They were
Right.
talking about immigration. They were talking about race. Things are all scrambled up. I mean, it's not like history repeats itself, really. What it actually feels like is when you're having one of those dreams where all the people in the dream are people who are in your daily life, but they're all like in different roles, or you run into them in a different location. And that is what it feels like when you go back into the 1850s, this very divisive and contentious time. People were arguing over many of the same things, just kind of in a different order or a slightly different way or with different faces and names.
Well, I saw, I think it was last week, maybe 10 days ago, the last surviving widow of a Confederate soldier died,
Yes.
which is astonishing.
Yes.
But it tells you how young the Republic is,
Yes.
you know.
Yeah. Isn't it also true, you'll correct me if I'm a little wrong, but I think there's still a couple of granddaughters of John Tyler, a president from the 1840s.
I think that's right.
Who are
Yeah.
alive, or were until very recently. Hope they still are with us. It is an amazing thing, Claiborne. It is an amazing thing to realize how close the early republic is to us, which is when this book is set, how close the Civil War is to us, how it echoes today, and how we're arguing over fundamentally the same thing. I mean, the way ultimately that Abraham Lincoln and some abolitionists before him framed the conflict in the 1860s was around the Declaration of Independence, the idea that all men are created equal. And then the question was, who's included in that phrase? As you probably know, Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, gave a speech at the beginning of the war, or perhaps just before the first shot, in which he said the cornerstone of the Confederacy was the idea that that line in the Declaration was a mistake and that society would be better if all men were not considered equal. This is the thing they were arguing about then. And it's the thing that we argue about now, really. I think we probably by now, virtually, except for, you know, the odd racist or the numerous racists perhaps, we all on some level accept the idea that everybody should be equal in America, but we still argue over what does that really mean? Does that mean equal opportunity? Does it mean equal outcome? Does it mean systems that treat everyone equally? What does it mean for the police to treat everyone equally, for the government to tax everyone in an equal way? This is the thing that we argue about all the time. It's the nature of America, and it's really enriching, sometimes troubling, but mostly enriching to go back into the past and see an earlier version of the argument we're having now.
Right. If you could have an evening with either John or Jesse, whom would you pick?
Wow. I think I'd choose Jessie because I think she was a more interesting talker. I think Fremont was more restrained and more guarded in his conversation. He was considered in many ways like, it's kind of one of the miracles of publicity. When people met him, they were surprised that he was smaller than they expected. He was very handsome. He was very well formed, but he was not a large figure. He didn't fill up the room. And my impression is that Jessie did fill up the room. She was not a large person either, but she was a large personality. and she had a lot to say. And I think that if I had an opportunity to have dinner with one of them, or whatever, as you said, an evening, I think Jessie would probably reveal a lot intentionally and unintentionally by what she said and how she said it.
And of course, her father was fascinating.
Yeah,
Big
Thomas.
player.
Yeah,
Big player.
yeah, it's a name to know, Thomas Hart Benton. And there are traces of it in modern life. I was driving through Oregon a few years ago and found myself in Benton County, and there are a number of those. There is a painter, Thomas Hart Benton, who is from the same family, a descendant in some way of Senator Thomas Hart Benton. He was in the Senate for 30 years. He was one of the original senators of Missouri. At that time, from 1821 to 1851, Missouri started that period as the westernmost American state. And Benton kind of took the rest of the American West as his own responsibility. He was an ambitious guy who saw the future and saw the future of an America facing the Pacific. He thought that if America could get a bit of the Pacific coast and establish a Pacific seaport, they could trade across the Pacific directly with India and with China, and that there would be better trade that way than with Europe. And because all politics are local, he figured that trade would come back from the Pacific seaport across the West and through his city of St. Louis, and then it'd be very good for St. Louis. But he had this visionary idea of the world, of a world where America was dominant, and trading across the Pacific was the most important relationship that America would have, which is the world we're living in now. And the world that we're contemplating now and struggling to shape now as China rises.
He was on the scene for a long time and a participant, of course, throughout the 50s, even though he was in and out of power or of office.
Yeah.
But a larger than life figure, and you wonder how much of that she inherited.
Oh, a lot. And I mean, the talent for publicity, absolutely. Benton was a newspaper man before he was a senator. He regarded newspapers at a relatively early period like he's a newspaper man in the 18 teens, like 1817, 1818, 1819. And he said, newspapers are to America what the Forum was for Rome, the place where the public would get together and clash over issues and debate issues. And he was a newspaper man at this very early period where, you know, the newspaper would come out every single week, whether there was enough news for it or not. But it was a lively debate. And because of the mail service, this little newspaper that you got, might be 4 pages, would get newspapers from elsewhere in the country, and the editors would like clip out an article and set it in type and print it in their own paper. And so it became like people sharing articles on Twitter or sharing articles on Facebook. The newspaper would pass around articles that the editor had read from other papers elsewhere in the world. And you would get, I mean, if you get a chance to go into a library that has a collection of old newspapers, or go online, the Library of Congress has this feature called Chronicling America. Just go in there, 19th century newspapers. You can just explore them from anywhere. There's Mississippi newspapers in there. And you just get a hold of one of these newspapers, and it's incredible how much information is in there. Yeah. It was a really rich debate. Benton was part of it before he became a senator. It was his platform for his political career. And he was still making sure to be very close to newspaper men all the way through his political career. And he did pass it on to his daughter.
We've got a little time for questions from other people in the audience, and if there's something you want to ask Steve Inskeep, just send the question through the Q&A mechanism there. David Cruz has written in and observes that what did he say? He said Fremont was a mediocre, it calls him a mediocre general, and asks you, Steve, what do you think, what kind of president do you think he would have made?
Oh, I can give you the judgment of people who supported him for president. There was a newspaper editor named John Bigelow. He was one of the editors of the New York Post, a paper that of course exists even today. And it was a Republican paper then. And Bigelow was a big supporter of John Charles Fremont, but later turned against him. He was a mediocre general at best in the Civil War, and Lincoln had to fire him twice. He just wasn't good at leading large numbers of men. He wasn't good at making hard judgments or ruthless judgments. And after the experience of all that and some other things, Bigelow wrote at the end of his life that Fremont had performed his greatest service to America by being the nominee who brought together the original Republican Party. But thank God he wasn't actually elected president, because he would have been a terrible president. And if the Civil War had come when he was president instead of Lincoln, it wouldn't have worked out very well at all.
And Steve, I'm curious, how did you come to this subject? How did you get a hold of this and interested in this and thought that there was a book in it?
You know, there's a little bit of a connection to Mississippi in this, because I wrote an earlier book about Andrew Jackson and his long battle with John Ross of the Cherokees, the Cherokee chief, to remove 5 native nations from the southeastern United States, including some who had their homes in Mississippi. And that was a story of Western expansion. The book focuses more on Alabama than Mississippi, but Mississippi is part of the story. And it's the creation of those states in what were called the Old Southwest in the 1820s and 1830s, process in which Andrew Jackson played a huge role, and the removal of the Indians played a huge role. And that was an early phase of America's westward expansion. And I wanted to explore a little bit more of the story. And I had thought of the Fremonts because I had read of them as a kid. Fremont was so famous and so involved in so many different things that if you're a kid and you read books about, you know, the Old West, you know, like those Time Life books about the Old West, you come across references to Fremont. You read something about California or the conquest of California, Fremont is there. The gold rush, Fremont is there. You read about the Civil War and somebody mentions the prelude to the Civil War in the 1856 election, Fremont is there. You read about the first year of the Civil War and Fremont kind of screwing up as a general in Missouri, and he's there. And there is the story of the person he sent to Washington to argue with Lincoln that he was actually doing a good job, and that person was his wife, Jessie. So if you are into these topics, as I was as an apparently nerdy kid, you get some exposure to Fremont. It's never very deep, but he's mentioned, he's throughout these stories. And I decided I wanted to know the real story, the whole story. And there had been biographies of John Charles Fremont, don't get me wrong, but there had not been many. And there was a lot of room to learn more.
And another person has asked, what did Jessie see in him? What was the attraction for her?
Wow. She did simply fall in love with a handsome man. But beyond that, it's clear to me that he suited a couple of purposes that she wanted to have. We could talk more about Jessie, who writes in one of her memoirs late in life, "My father gave me early the place a son would have had." It took Senator Benton and his wife a long time to have an actual son. Jessie came along earlier, and her father did things with her in ways that you would expect in that time, in the 19th century, you would expect of a boy rather than a girl. Gave her a strong education rather than a kind of girl's education. Taught her foreign languages himself because he spoke some. Took her hunting and let her hold the bag with the dead bird after he had shot the bird. Took her with him to the United States Senate. He would deposit her in the Library of Congress for safekeeping. Took him with her to visit presidents, starting with Andrew Jackson. And she at some point decided in a way that she wanted to go from being this son, from being a boy to being a man. And I don't mean to suggest what that would mean perhaps today. I mean, there's no suggestion that she thought she was a boy, but she wanted to do the things that were restricted from her. And she decided at some point she wanted to check out of Washington high society, which she was absolutely part of. She didn't want to get married as her friends, teenage friends were being married off to older men. And she just wanted to be her father's assistant. And she cut off her hair and told him this. And he, at that point, no longer wanted her to be a boy because it was time for her to be a woman. and he really disapproved of the haircut and everything else. So she couldn't be his assistant, but she went and found and eloped with this explorer who kind of was Senator Benton's assistant. He wanted to develop the West, and he was going to do it through the work of John Charles Fremont. And so if she couldn't be her father's assistant, she could assist this man who assisted him. And
Wow.
she could live in politics and exploration and national development through him.
Fascinating.
And then just one point, her father did not support John Fremont in 1856.
No. I mean, it's an incredible story. I mean, can you imagine if you're running for president and your father-in-law says, nah, I can't do it. And it's also a kind of tragic story, which gets at the complexity of slavery and anti-slavery and pro-slavery politics at that time. Benton was a guy who was not in favor of seceding from the Union. He was in favor of the Union. He felt strongly that the slave power, as they would call it, slave interests, slave owners in the South, had far too much power over the country. And so his outlook was essentially anti-slavery and Republican, even though he himself all his life owned at least a few slaves.
Right.
But he was against the power of slave interests. He could easily have gone over to the Republican Party, but he didn't want to abandon the Democratic Party that he was a great leader in. And it appears also that he just did not trust his son-in-law's judgment, which, as we've said, he was not alone in that distrust. Many people over time had reason to wonder why John C. Fremont made the decisions he did and whether he would really be a reliable person to run the country.
Steve, I know there are other people vying for your attention, and we don't want to hold you up any longer. It's great for you to spend
I'm here
this
as
time.
long as we can do a lightning round if you want, whatever you want.
Well, see, Claiborne, do you have anything?
What are you working on now, Steve? Besides Morning Edition?
Thank you.
You
Well,
working
there's a
on a
lot of
book?
reporting to do, but
Yeah.
yes, I am. I'm working on a biography of Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, good. Well,
And I'm pretty well in. It's a
there's
short
somebody who hasn't
biography.
been written about much.
Yeah, you don't read, no. And it's daunting. It's daunting to begin a book
I'm
about
sure.
it because you think, what can I possibly say that hasn't been said? But I've read, I've had books of his letters and speeches around the house for as long as I could remember. He's been a great influence, I think, in how I write and how I think. And I would like to think that by the end of this, we might have something interesting to say.
It's great. And I guess as time goes on, there are always different periods and different ways to reflect on how Lincoln is relevant today to those periods.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, fascinating, and thanks once again for doing this. I want to remind listeners that we've got copies of the book. Steve very generously signed some book plates, so we have actually somewhat autographed copies. And so if you forgot somebody at Christmas, or you've got a sweetheart for Valentine's Day, it makes a nice gift.
A romantic tale, in a way.
Doing my job.
I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Claiborne. Very, very nice. Appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Good night.
Good night.